implicit biases.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias, which means unconscious bias.
For many, the shootings in Tulsa and Charlotte are proof of police bias. But research confirms it's not just the cops.
The hard fact is that women run only 4% of companies in the Fortune 500.
She accuses the entire country of implicit bias, essentially suggesting that everyone, including our police, are basically racist and prejudiced.
The sexist insult is bad enough, but interrupting a woman who is talking about sexism to make a sexist insult.
Most of us in our conscious mind, we don't want to be biased. Most of us don't want to be overweight, but we still eat donuts.
It's a message about bias, and whether it's conscious or subconscious, it's hurting people.
If you're human, you have bias. Just like we breathe, we have bias. It's part of who we are. When it becomes completely unconscious, we have no idea how it's affecting our behavior.
I see you, I make a quick judgment about you as a person, depending on my stereotypes about what somebody like you in your role should look like or could look like.
The implicit bias that leads people to make negative judgments about people of color, older people versus young people, people who look gay, whatever that means, versus people who look straight. Those kinds of negative judgments flow from us not based on necessarily who we are. They flow from us based on what we're perceiving.
Neuroscientists tell us that at any given moment, there's about 11 million bits of data a second coming into the processing centers of your brain through your senses. We have evolved to whittle that data set down to one that we can actually handle.
No one really feels like they're biased. And it's not that they're self-aggrandizing at all. It's no different to not having the machinery to do, 2 math tasks at once. We don't feel biased because we actually can't process if we're being biased or not in real time.
We want to create a playing field that is level for everyone. The challenge is we tend to think about our own behavior as somehow more fair and free of bias than it is.
The origins of implicit bias are really interesting because they come from so many different places. We evolved over millions of years to have the kind of brains that we have today. Those brains were set up to allow our ancestors to survive in an old world, a world where they lived with groups of people just like them. Somebody who lived on the other side of the mountain was typically an enemy. We have inherited a part of those people, to be suspicious of people who are different from us, because that's what made our ancestors survive. Which is why we shouldn't beat ourselves up for the kind of brains we have. We should just ask ourselves the following question: is that useful in the modern world? If I look at you and I think, yeah, you and I are one, then I will use the brain resources that I would have used to think for myself what's good for me, and I'm going to give those to you. And of course, from that come a variety of differences in decisions. And it's by giving a leg up to the ones who come from my university or my neighborhood or my kind of people in some way. That's the way in which I continually keep the playing field uneven. And I can feel good about it at the end of the day. I helped somebody.
How do our actions, however well-intended, reflect our biases? As a filmmaker, as a businesswoman, as a mother, I've always been aware of gender bias and how it influences the opportunities I have and the decisions I make every day. Did I get into the room because I am a woman, or in spite of it? And what's it like for people that don't have my privilege? Unconscious bias affects all of us in different ways, depending on who we are. There are countless biases, far too many to cover in one film. I wanted to explore unconscious bias and how it relates to gender and race. Where does it come from? What is its impact? And is there anything we can do to change it?
All right, people on the street, take one.
What is unconscious bias?
Don't know.
Unconscious bias.
I have no idea.
I think it's something ingrained in the back of your head that you don't know that you're biased about.
What is unconscious bias?
All of the horrible things that we do to each other that we pretend we don't do.
Bias is when you have like a preconceived notion about somebody or something based on things you've been told or seen growing up.
I feel like everyone has a bias, no matter skin color, or, you know, nationality or religious background.
What are some of your biases?
Oh no, that I can't discuss. I don't know.
Look, I know you're not like that. But if it would make you feel better, you should take this internet test my brother-in-law made us all take last Thanksgiving. It's a good test. Said I was racially unbiased. And I love gay people. I didn't see that one coming, but I'm happy.
Roger, show me this test.
There really is a test. It's called the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. And the first one was created in 1994. It turns out the way we unconsciously link two unrelated ideas in our minds helps reveal the root of implicit bias. Over 17 million people have taken the IAT online, and thousands of scientific studies are based on it.
Okay,
so what do we have here?
Robin, this is the IAT, the Implicit Association Test, that measures what we call the gender career stereotype, which is the association between male or female and career or family.
Put a left finger on the E key for the items that belong to the category career.
Right.
And put a right finger on the I key for items that belong to the family.
Right.
Okay.
Mazarine and I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a measure of implicit judgments, stereotypes, attitudes, so we could see how people differed in what was in their memories that was guiding their behavior without their awareness. The trick in the implicit association test is when you use only two keys. If the combinations are used with flowers and pleasant words on one key, insects and unpleasant words on the other key, you just zip right through it, but then switch one of the contrasts. So now flowers have to go with unpleasant words and insects with pleasant words, and all of a sudden performance falls to pieces. You start making errors, you go much slower, and you get very frustrated. When I first did this, I thought, oh, I'll just practice it a while, I'll get better. And I repeated it, and I repeated it, and I repeated it again, and it didn't get better.
It's not that people would be surprised if you said to them, I think you like flowers more than you like insects. What is surprising is that we would believe that we could control that. That if you tell me, be neutral, Mazarine, the fact that I cannot do that is what is so interesting.
Family and male. Oh my God. Female. Wow.
Okay, now you're going to get a result, I think.
I'm afraid to see the
Here
result.
is your result. Read it.
Your data suggests a strong automatic association for male with career and female with family.
Which,
wow.
Well, it's not a failure. You are just showing what's in your head, which is something that most of us are carrying with us.
I did not want to believe the test results. How could I, as a woman who believes in gender equality, have a strong association that reflects such traditional values as men with work and women with family? What other biases am I carrying? Am I alone in this?
When I gave myself the first version of this race test, I thought I was a totally unprejudiced person, and I do believe that I am unprejudiced, but this test is picking up something that I now regard as different from prejudice or racism, but I'm carrying something with me that is a liability in circumstances in which I want to behave equally to white and black people because I've got these automatic associations that are going to pop up and influence my responses and judgments without my even thinking about it.
People often will say, oh, if you show an implicit bias, then you're a racist. We think it's important to reserve the word racist for people who explicitly, consciously say things that we would classify as racism. What the implicit bias test is picking up is sort of the thumbprint of the culture on our brain.
I think people don't like to use the word racism or sexism because it implies an intention behind it. And the reason why bias is easier to hear is that it implies there's a brain functioning happening in the background, and yet the outcome is often the same. If I'm overtly sexist and say I don't want women on my team, or if I'm implicitly biased and I don't value women, and the outcome is that there are no women on my team, the result is the same.
We were hoping that McCann Erickson could provide, at the minimum, an introduction to your department store clients, so we can assess their desire for a store brand.
I know they'd be happy to meet you.
Especially Dan Higgins. He loves redheads.
Back in the days of Mad Men, or in the 50s, or even earlier, there was no need to suggest that we thought of men and women exactly the same in terms of their capacities, abilities, their career trajectories. But now we've embraced a much more egalitarian set of expectations for all of us, that we can really do anything regardless of the social categories we inhabit. Unconscious bias is just one mechanism, one stream that may support the racism or sexism that we're all trying to dismantle.
I recommend not feeling guilt, but feeling responsibility. It's giving us a picture of something that we can't intuit ourselves. And once we have that, then it's up to individuals to decide what they want to do with it, up to institutions, and of course, as a society, we can collectively decide what we want to do with it.
The impact of unconscious bias can have ripple effects across a community, and perhaps no sector of our society is more compromised by or alerted to this than law enforcement. What role does bias play when split-second decisions can mean the difference between life and death?
So this is a functional near-infrared imaging device, or an FNIR. I'm just going to sit it on your forehead, and it will measure the level of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood flow in your prefrontal cortex. And all that means is it's going to give me an indicator of your cognitive workload, so how hard you're working, how much mental effort it's taking you throughout the task. So this is the Weapons Implicit Association Test, or IAT.
Harmless objects, weapons, Black Americans, white Americans. These are 7 parts. The instructions change for each part. Pay attention. Your data suggests a moderate automatic association for harmless objects with white Americans and weapons with Black Americans. Okay. Wow. Moderate automatic association of Black Americans with weapons and white Americans with harmless objects, 30%. Only 1% has a strong automatic association of white Americans with weapons. 1% compared to 24%.
How do you feel about your results?
Well, I'm somewhat embarrassed. I mean, I hate that I have that association. I honestly don't think that I do intentionally. Obviously, that's why it's the implicit association.
And as you can see, it is unfortunately the norm in the United States.
Okay. Wow. Humbling. So these numbers are web numbers. The people that actually come in here to the lab to take it, where do they normally score on this?
Well, it depends on their occupation. Police officers tend to score a little bit higher on the implicit association between Black Americans and weapons than members of the general public. One of the things that we look at here in this lab are, obviously, we look at implicit biases, but we also look at behavioral biases. And oftentimes the two are not particularly related to each other.
To better understand the potential link between this tragic reality and police bias, researchers Lois and Steve James study police behavior at Washington State University.
Follow me.
Data from their lab was used to develop the Counter Bias Training Simulator, or CBT Sim.
So we can't have any live weapons in the lab. If you'd like to take a key, put your firearms, tasers, pepper, and any backup weapons you may have. In encounters that we see in the military and law enforcement that are fast-paced, they can have serious consequences and serious outcomes. We can't always sit back and wait for all the pieces of the puzzle to align. Now, if we have these subconscious biases or these implicit biases that are filling in those blanks for us, they better be doing it in an appropriate way and not filling in blanks based on negative stereotypes that aren't factual, that aren't based on the reality of the circumstance that I'm seeing right now. I come to this problem having been through it and understand that it's not easy. There's no other arm of government that has the right to take away your liberty and up to your life without due process. We give that authority and ability to law enforcement, and we have to be able to hold them accountable. How do we do that if we're not understanding what the limit of performance is? When we look at professional sports teams, yeah, we expect a professional athlete in the basketball court to make a three-pointer, but we wouldn't expect them to make half-court shots every time. So where's that limit within the use of force with law enforcement, and how does physiology and neurophysiology play into that?
Great to meet you, Lois James.
Nick Briggs.
Great.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So we're going to go into the simulator, and we're going to engage in a little bit of our counter-bias training simulation. The goal of the training is to really try and focus in on the objective level of threat and not focus on any suspect characteristics. Right, so this is a Glock 22, and it has been modified with a laser insert, so it's now a dry-fire weapon. It can't take any rounds, okay?
When officers come in and they're going through the use of force simulators, what we're really trying to understand is this limit of human performance within these fast-paced, low-information encounters that can end in tragedy.
Spokane Police, let me see your hands. Drop it.
We've had experienced SWAT officers whose heart rates have more than doubled in almost a single heartbeat in the simulator. So very, very strong reactions. We've had a handful of civilians in there who've run out of the room.
Hey, let her go, partner. Let her go. Ma'am, come up the stairs towards me. Sir, you need to let her go. The stairs, let go of her. Come to me, ma'am.
Wow, what are you feeling?
It's a tribute to these types of training environments that they feel real. You know, your adrenaline is going. What we're trying to train is not just the physical skill of drawing a weapon and firing. What we know is that the most complex and the hardest part of it is the mental process. And we all know that we perform differently under stress.
Well, with the officers that we've tested in our lab thus far, we really have seen strong evidence of implicit bias associating African Americans and weapons. About 96% of our officers hold at least a mild association between African Americans and weapons. Some officers have strong implicit biases, and that maps over to their decisions in the simulator. An equal number have strong implicit biases, and that almost counter-predicts their behavior in the simulator. So one of the main take-homes from our lab is that you cannot make the assumption that just because an officer has implicit biases against a particular demographic means that they're going to behave in a way that discriminates against that demographic.
The results that we found, where they're more hesitant to shoot African Americans and they make fewer threats, we're tentatively characterizing that as almost a counter bias, as in they understand that they have a bias and they're trying to inhibit that. And understanding where that control comes from, that even though they have this negative association or this stronger physiological response, if they're not letting it negatively drive their behavior, that's what we want to promote. And then we can start focusing on supporting training, policy, procedure, and maybe even technology that helps us keep bias out of our behavior.
You know, from an evolutionary perspective, bias at its core is a survival heuristic. You know, I mean, bias is there to help us survive. So combating bias is a very difficult thing to do. Obviously, for a group like law enforcement, it's a very important thing to do. You can have that gut feeling. It just has to be based on something that actually matters.
Lois's comment left a deep impression on me. Police officers make critical decisions with serious implications. How do they know when to follow their gut and when to question it? And if bias is simply a part of who we are, essentially embedded in our psyche, then what can we do to control it?
The question, can we debug or debias the mind? This is actually the huge question. It turns out not to be as easy as many expect. Many think that just discovering that you have an implicit bias that you'd rather not have, that's it. I now understand it. I understand what's in my head. I'm cured. No, you have to do things actually to take steps to prevent it from interfering. The ideal type of solution is one that just totally takes the cues that can trigger associations that may be potentially disparity-producing or discriminatory, takes them out of the picture, and of course the blind audition is the prototype example.
It turns out that orchestras weren't even trying to fix a gender bias. They were worried that they were overly selecting the musicians who came from the famous musicians group. So they worried that, you know, if a kid had studied with Stravinsky, that they were more likely to pick that kid. And it came about as a discussion amongst two groups of people who believed the orchestra was not biased at all in favor of these kids, and others who thought maybe they were. And it was, I think, almost as a joke that they said, well, if we really care about this, we'll put a curtain. And so they decided to actually audition people without being able to see them. So if you were the selector, you would just have a list of numbers, not names, and you would listen. Orchestras are lucky because all of their data are concentrated into one modality, sound. So they could do that. They could remove every visual cue and then look to see how the data came out. Women went from being largely little harp players quietly playing in the corner to becoming not quite half, but close to half of the orchestra because you couldn't see them.
As a footnote, you could actually tell whether the performer was wearing a skirt or high heels because you could hear those. And so women discovered that they got to get rid of those in the audition, and then it became truly a level playing field.
Blind auditioning is wonderful at taking care of bias at that last moment of, you know, where it might affect you because you just see what the person looks like or whether they're wearing a skirt or high heels or not. But it doesn't take care of other kinds of biases that lead people to be able to get to Juilliard itself or not. So it's worth thinking about it and trying to fix it, but it's not a panacea. It's not going to take care of many other things.
I would like to know why the last associate producer before me made $50 a week more than I do.
Oh, because he was a man.
When the U.S. women's soccer team won the World Cup last year, there were celebrations and acclaim for their achievement. But 5 members of that team have now filed a complaint with the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they say U.S. soccer is practicing wage discrimination.
These women, they train just as hard as the men do. You know, we inspire as many young players around the world. There's no reason why you need to have 100, 200 to 1 disparity in pay.
That's despite drawing crowds of similar size and racking up unprecedented achievements, like their 3rd World Cup trophy and back-to-back-to-back Olympic gold medals.
Like anybody getting into their workforce, right? You get in and you're like, wow, I'm here, I've arrived. And you're just so grateful and thankful for getting the paycheck, for making it. And for me, it was a dream come true to play on the women's national team. And then here we are, we're this women's soccer team who we play in these world championships. We take a nation by storm. People are mesmerized by what we do. And then behind the scenes, all this back chatter stuff that the millions of Americans who cheer us on, they don't know is happening. For me, it was definitely a process to realize the discrimination that was in fact happening. And it wasn't like happening to them, it was happening to me, to us. I found myself on a stage at the end of my career, ESPN was honoring me with this Icon Award, along with Kobe Bryant and Peyton Manning. I remember feeling like, gosh, this is amazing. I'm next to Kobe and Peyton. These guys are the icons, right?
For me, whether it's about equitable pay or equal opportunity for female athletes, or any issue about fairness and injustice, that's what I'm most proud of.
We do our thing, we accept our Icon Awards, and we're walking off the stage into very different retirements. These guys have made hundreds of millions of dollars. I have not. It's not easy to be in negotiations. And so when you're standing across the table from the people who are writing your checks telling you that you don't deserve this, that's hard. It's really emotionally taxing because you're literally putting your body on the line every single game.
History is made! Goal number 159!
I was one of the best players on the team for the time that I was on the team. So my position was not necessarily ever in jeopardy, but I was still scared. I was still scared to speak up. The argument that is made all the time about the pay gap and the discrimination that is happening is that revenue isn't the same as it is for the men. There are many years that I know for a fact that the women's national soccer team was bringing in more money than the men. Our final in the 2015 Women's World Cup was the most watched game in the history of North American soccer, ever, men or women. We deserve this because we deserve this and we've earned it. It is the way it is because we haven't done anything to change it. This is an institutional problem that is permeating throughout the rest of our world. I was a professional athlete, so for some people this might not translate, but it really is happening everywhere. The fight is not ever going to be over until the checks are the same.
Well, pay inequality is a very difficult topic. In terms of pay discrepancies for the same jobs, that gap actually is already quite small. I'm not in any way kind of justifying that gap, but the unexplained residual for kind of same job, same experience, same education, everything else identical, is on average below 10% in this country. Now, we typically talk about a different number. We typically talk about kind of 22 cents pay gap, roughly speaking, for white women compared to white men, and that pay gap is much bigger for African Americans, for Hispanic women compared to white men. It also differs by state in this country. So in some states, the gap is much larger than in others. But that is a different definition of the pay gap. So that's including the fact that we have more, for example, male doctors and more female nurses, and generally doctors make more money than female nurses. So that's not necessarily comparing apples with apples.
On the one hand, there's no excuse for the differences. There is just no excuse. Pay between men and women, between people of color, for doing the same work, same job. However, the interesting thing is just being a person who runs an office and runs a business. Part of it is just how we are actually, like our Constitution and how we think about these things. And I will actually use myself personally. I've never, ever gone in to advocate for more pay for myself with my board. Now, I haven't done that because maybe I also thought it was fair, or I thought that it wasn't necessary, but I've never done it. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, I've done it, no big deal, and this, that, and the other. But it's just very interesting to see there's a big difference between men and women on this issue in terms of our own self-advocacy.
I'm beginning to worry a lot about who even believes that they should apply for a job. I think that there is deep bias there, including in very good people who don't believe they should put themselves forward. When young women don't apply for jobs, I, as an older woman, can yell at them. I can tell them, if you don't apply for the job, how can we hire you? But then I remembered that I was, at age 28, exactly that person. I did not apply for the first job I got. My husband sent my CV in. When I got a call from the university because they had no supporting materials, that's when I realized that this rascal had mailed my CV in. And I say to people, you shouldn't be reliant on a feminist husband to mail your CV in. You should do it yourself.
I served as academic dean of the Kennedy School for a number of years, and the job of the academic dean is faculty hiring and faculty promotion. You can imagine this is kind of a chief HR kind of job. I once made an offer to a very senior female faculty member. And as those of you who've ever been in negotiation know, you don't necessarily start with your best possible offer. And she just accepted. That was a very interesting moment for me where I talked to the then dean of the school and said, I have to go back to her and up my own offer because otherwise I'm going to discriminate against her. Because surely she's not negotiating because she might actually know about the research showing that women who negotiate assertively might make a bit more money but will be liked less. Heidi Roizen is a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. And in 2000, a colleague of mine wrote a case study about how Heidi had built her enterprises, about her networks in Silicon Valley.
She really wanted to have a female protagonist because she said there aren't enough female protagonists in HBS cases. So she cold called me and said, would you be willing to be the subject of this case and can I interview you? And I said, sure.
And then a few years later, some creative colleagues of ours, in fact two men, took this very same case and replaced Heidi's name with Howard. And they ran a little experiment.
So he got Harvard's permission, unbeknownst to me, to change the case from the Heidi Roizen case to the Howard Roizen case. The only thing he changed, I think the one, other than the name and the gender, is I think somewhere in the case it said I was head cheerleader in high school, and so he changed that to quarterback of the football team. I think that was the only thing he changed. And then he taught the case in 2 sections, and then he asked the students to take a survey on both how competent is Heidi or Howard, whichever one you happen to have, and how much you would enjoy working with and for Heidi or Howard. And interestingly, his analysis showed that Heidi and Howard were deemed equally capable, but Howard was way more likable, and that most people wanted to work for Howard, and they perceived Heidi as being a little too aggressive, a little too manipulated, a little too out for herself than Howard.
Both men and women think that Heidi and Howard did a good job. So they're competent, they're effective, they're good leaders. But people tend not to like Heidi. It's called the competence likability dilemma that women but not men experience. What that means is that we either perceive a woman as likable or she's competent. And she's competent when she's assertive, when she's a leader, when she is like Heidi Roizen, but then we're less likely to like her.
Dr. Lahiri, I understand you're a single, you've recently, but without a, not that you have...
Oh, I'm a single mother.
You're a single mother?
Yes.
Can you balance that with doing this stressful job?
Absolutely. I mean, having a child has actually given me so much more focus. Oh, and I don't exercise, so that's an extra 10 minutes a day that goes just towards work.
I see. And as a leader, do you have the ability to keep your emotions at bay and think logically under stressful situations?
My emotions? Oh, I've learned to eat those. Not a problem. Yeah, for sure. Do you ask everyone that question?
Yes, of course.
So when I was pregnant for the second time, I did not tell folks that I work with I was pregnant until I was 6 months pregnant. I had like such a wide variety of camouflage clothes. It's embarrassing. Because I was afraid of people discounting my work or discounting me, knowing that I was pregnant. And I just wish I hadn't done it. I wish I had just said, who cares, I'm pregnant. It's how we propagate the human race. Like, why, I mean, and so what if people give me a hard time? Then like maybe this isn't where I should be working. Like, I did not think it all the way through. I just thought like, oh, people, when they look at me, will be like, oh, she's going on maternity leave, or oh, I wonder if she's gonna take her work less seriously.
It is frustrating, and you see I'm getting like emotional about it because it makes me angry to assume that I am less ambitious because I have a uterus and I can have babies. And that's just not true. And so when I think about the mommy penalty, I just put it out there. I had my second baby here, and there was a woman who was having a baby right after me. And I sat down and I said, I gotta take maternity leave. I gotta do it. Even if I don't wanna be gone the whole time, I have to take time off because I want her to know that when she has her baby in 3 months, that she can take maternity leave and come back to her job.
Certainly one of the most clear forms of discrimination I feel like I felt as a female politician was people telling me that it was irresponsible of me to run for mayor when my children were so young. And I heard that from more women than even men. Even our bias against our own identity can be baked in. So the fact that other women were telling me not to run for mayor because it would make me a bad mother really bothered me. Obviously, I did not take that advice. I'm fortunate to have a very supportive family, a very supportive partner who said, no, I think being a good mother is having a goal, caring about your community, and going after a dream. That's being a good mother.
Wow, perfect. That's amazing.
I certainly have seen interruptions to my career during the periods in which I was having children. I had one situation where I was going off on maternity leave, and no one at my level had ever gone off on maternity leave. So there wasn't an example to draw from. And that's why it's so important that as women, when we see the professions, when we see the rooms, that there are no women in those rooms, those are the ones we have to get into. That's how we change those rooms.
Implicit bias is sort of an amalgam of many different things that make us the kind of people that we are. And one way to study the roots of bias is to look at the brain directly, which we can do. We did a study in which we introduced people to two individuals, John and David. John and David were both great people. They were described as having done amazingly good things. There was only one difference between them. One happened to be liberal, the other conservative. If I'm the subject in the study, one of these people matches me and the other one does not match me. We now have people like me, the subject, make decisions about John and David. Simple decisions that have nothing to do with politics. You know, in the summer, what do you think he might do? What kind of foods does he like to eat? We discovered that our brains think about these two people in slightly different regions. So in the medial prefrontal cortex, there is a region we call the more dorsal part and the more ventral part. And what we find is that when you think about the one who's like you, you're using that ventral area. When you're thinking about the one who's a little different from you, you're actually using a different part of neural real estate. And this is important because the neurons that we are using to think about the one who happens to be like us are the neurons that we use to think about the most precious person in the universe to us, and that is we ourselves.
How we see ourselves is shaped by countless factors, from genetics to life experience to what we ate for breakfast this morning. New breakthroughs in technology allow us to virtually step outside ourselves and maybe even recalibrate how we see the world. Can it also transform the biases we carry within us?
In virtual reality, we can program a virtual body to replace your real body. We can replace where you are. We can also replace who you are. And by replacing who you are, by changing your body, that leads to differences in attitudes, behaviors, and so on. In your living room, you can be walking with the Sherpas up Mount Everest. You can be a black person being interviewed by a white policeman. Or you can be a white policeman interviewing a black person. So it really expands greatly the range of experiences any person can have, way beyond that they could do in physical reality. The brain quickly responds to any circumstance it's in and has to make a fast judgment. What's going on here? What should I do? I know it's virtual reality, but they're still, to you, they're real experiences.
Q left, P right. Oh, it's the IAT.
If in these tests you demonstrate this implicit bias, most people will, then that also manifests itself in some behaviors. We did this first experiment and we found this reduction of racial bias after being embodied in a black body, which didn't happen if you were in a white body. 2 exposures was enough to give you a reduction in racial bias that lasted at least 1 week. The implicit association test is a good way to do this measurement. However, what we really want is how you would behave in real life.
I will first guide you through the experiment, give you some basic instructions, and help you put on the gear. During the experience, you will see a virtual body substituting your own body. First, you will have to do some basic body movements in order to familiarize yourself with it and with the environment.
We were interested in whether the virtual embodiment in another race, whether that would also impact something as basic and unconscious as mimicry.
Primero, vamos a girar la cabeza. Hacia arriba y hacia abajo. Ahora colocamos los brazos en T.
You have two people in a virtual environment, one real and the other one virtual, and you as the real person, when you look at your body, it could either be a so-called white body or a so-called black body, and your partner is also white or black. So the virtual character was programmed to do things like scratch the head, touch the arm, and what we were looking at is how much you mimicked the actions of the virtual character. We know from social psychology that when two people are in harmony, they tend to unconsciously mimic each other's behaviors. One might be tapping their foot and the other one tapping the finger in synchrony. And if, like, you go to a restaurant, you look at couples around, you can kind of tell those that are in a dance together and those that are not. And it's called the chameleon effect.
So how do you feel? It was shocking and sort of fascinating to see my skin black. When I looked in the mirror, it wasn't until I moved that I realized that that was me moving. And so, yes, that's a powerful moment because I realized that this person with black skin that was moving was actually me.
It's you, yeah. Well, another thing that you might or might not have noticed is that the virtual character beside you was performing some body movements, unconscious body movements, you know, like a slight sway or crossing her arms, turning her head. That at some points you also copied yourself. And this is what is the point of the whole experiment, is to see whether unconsciously we mimic more in-group or out-group members that we interact with.
I think I did relate a little bit better to the woman next to me, given that at the time, we were both black.
You can change something quite deep-seated simply by changing the virtual body and nothing else. And in most things in everyday life, it doesn't matter, but it does matter in a job interview. The way implicit associations work, by embodying yourself in a character or in a body which represents an out-group, you're disrupting all of your own associations. So it doesn't make someone who's biased unbiased, but it does make them less biased.
Regardless of the virtual body I inhabit in the lab, I will walk out the door a white woman. Even though it was brief, this experience stuck with me. Could virtual reality disrupt my biases? And could technology ultimately open the door to a future where bias is programmed out of our lives?
Human judgment has systematic biases and errors. How would you correct for that? Well, one way to correct for that is to have an assist. So it's no different than automatic lane guidance systems. When you're driving a car, you're actually veering off the lane, beep, 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 and then you actually take it over. It doesn't mean the human is taken out, but there is this idea that you could have computers or systems or algorithms that help you in the driving. So abstractly, it sounds like a tremendously good idea.
Intelligent machines, especially those based on machine learning algorithms, rely a lot of the kind of data that you give them to train these algorithms. So if you want a machine to be able to look at an image and recognize whether it's a cat or a dog, you give a lot of examples of cats, a lot of examples of dogs, and you tell them this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a cat, this is a dog, and then hopefully when you show him a new image that he hasn't seen before of a cat or a dog, then the machine hopefully is able to recognize it. If you don't give these training data, which are diverse enough of all the possible cats and dogs, then the decision-making capabilities of these algorithms that comes out after the training is going to behave in an incorrect way. So the bias is mostly not in the algorithm itself, but in the data that you feed these algorithms to be trained.
It's possible to pick up the kinds of stereotypes that lead to prejudicial behavior in humans with a machine just by observing our culture. This isn't just about, watching the Brady Bunch and then deciding that women don't have careers and men are all architects, right? We use this all the time in artificial intelligence. This is how web search works.
If you go to any search engine and you type grandma, you will see what comes out. Mostly white old ladies. And this is not diverse enough to represent this entity, which is a grandma. And it's not because the search engine is intentionally putting that bias. It's because the data that we feed and we put on the web, all of us, do not follow the correct distribution. And so if you use that data to train a machine to make decisions about grandmas, then it's going to be biased.
When you look at AI and people say, we're concerned about bias being introduced into AI, I tell people it's already there because we're the one teaching AI. We're the one setting up the models. We're the one providing the data. And all of our biases, known and unknown, become introduced at that point.
A lot of artificial intelligence isn't literally programmed like if-then. If you see a person named John, then give him 5 months. It's actually built up by actually training on a very large data set. So you're just feeding a smart computer lots of examples. And by looking at the examples, it learns patterns and weightings, and that's how it develops its algorithm. It's deep learning. So in some sense, human beings didn't even program the artificial intelligence. They gave it just patterns to learn, and then it started learning by itself. But then this is where the other problem comes in. Garbage in, garbage out. What we give to the computer might describe the world, but if we describe the world as an unfair world, because it is an unfair world, the computer will think an unfair world is in fact the right answer.
Where artificial intelligence is biased because we're biased, well then as we improve as a culture, artificial intelligence will also improve as long as we leave the learning turned on.
At the start of all this, when I first took the IAT, my results were so shocking to me that I went home and took the test again, thinking it must be wrong. But I have taken it again, and I've had similar results. Learning I've hidden biases makes me feel like I don't know some part of myself. Trying to understand what is at the base of some of my perceptions and judgments, how that has affected the people I hang out with and the choices I make, that's what led me on this journey. I'm concerned about how my actions impact other people. When I make a really quick judgment about somebody, why? Why did I choose to cross the street just then? What was that choice based on? And owning it, knowing that was me, not them. There isn't an easy way to change our biases, but looking in the mirror just might be the best place to start.
We cannot let our personal experiences only determine our values and our decisions. We've got to be able to rise above that, because our decisions are going to affect people who come from groups so alien to ours, and especially in America, which to me is sort of the test country. Let's send 1 million strange people to this country year after year after year, from 150 different countries. Let's see if they can hack it. Let's see if they can actually figure out a reasonable way to live.
I think you have to be vigilant about making sure, if you are a believer in diversity, that you truly do seek it out. I don't think a woman being in the room by virtue of there being a woman there solves the problem. I don't think by virtue of there being 2 women in a room it solves the problem. But I do think to the extent there's a culture of inclusion that starts to put unacceptable behavior on notice. So it's not just the presence of that person of color or that woman. It is someone understanding they must use their power for good. And even if they don't think they have a lot of power, their voice is important.
We need visionaries that see the potential in not just women, but in equality across the board.
I hope that where we're going to be in 25 years is that we're not just talking about intentions,
We're not just talking about whether or not a person was biased or an institution was intentionally designed to be unfair. We have to start holding ourselves accountable for the results. And our good intentions are clearly not enough.
It's not enough just to say, I want to be a good person, I am a good person, I recognize this is happening and I want to, make sure it doesn't. Instead, it goes back to the importance of putting people in close contact with those who they might otherwise have negative associations with, so that they end up naturally developing positive associations instead. That's a long-term process.
So the fact that nobody is immune from bias, I think, is both scary but also liberating. It's liberating because this discussion is not about pointing fingers. It is about all of us. It is about how our minds are built.
People don't want to admit, that's the thing, they don't want to admit they have bias, right? They're like, I'm the least racist person you know, right? I mean, yeah, no, you're not. Nobody is. And, I'm the least sexist person, that's not how it works. And you have to have the self-awareness to understand that you do have these blind spots, you are biased, and surround yourself with people who can help you grow.
The only thing I want to emphasize about responsibility as connected to unconscious or implicit bias is, if you believe that you have it and that it actually has some consequences on the human beings around you, the only responsibility you have is, what are you willing to do about it?